Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, Midway, Okinawa. All are battles that stand alongside the most monumental ever fought in the Second World War. In every one of them, the aircraft carrier played a central role. By the end of World War II, the aircraft carrier had become undisputed mistress of the seas, the most powerful and effective surface ship in the world. But just a few short years before, the aircraft carrier had been a second-line vessel whose role within the fleet was to serve as a support for the big guns of the battleship. World War II saw those roles reversed, and it was in the historic battles fought between the United States and Japan in the Pacific Theater, the largest, most complex, and far-flung naval war in history, that the carrier proved itself. How and why were the great carrier battles of World War II fought? Part of the answer lies in the evolution of the aircraft carrier and its tactics in the years before the war. At the beginning of this century, the battleship was the most powerful ship afloat. Naval battles for hundreds of years had been decided by great formations of warships pounding each other into submission with gunfire. The battleship was the apotheosis of that tradition, but even as early as 1910, the first tenuous experiments were being made at flying an aircraft from the decks of a ship. The U.S. Navy led the way in these pioneering attempts. Civilian pilot and professional daredevil Eugene Ely's flight off the cruiser Birmingham and his later landing on the USS Pennsylvania. Craft could take off and land safely from the decks of a ship. How these newfangled contraptions would be used at sea was a matter of heated debate. It would be nearly 20 years before a proper aircraft carrier and tactics were developed to fully employ the potential of the airplane. Ironically, it was the largest disarmament agreement in history up to that time that gave an important push to the development of the carrier. The year was 1921, and the world's great naval powers were meeting in Washington, D.C. to try and head off a costly and potentially explosive naval arms race. The United States, Great Britain, Japan, France, and Italy eventually signed an agreement setting strict limits on the numbers and tonnages of many types of warships, including aircraft carriers. However, since carriers were thought of as second-line vessels whose main function was to provide long-range scouting and air defense for the fleet, the limits placed on them were considerably above the numbers of carriers possessed by the signatory nations. As a result, the United States and Japan began converting ships that otherwise would have had to be scrapped under the terms of the treaty into aircraft carriers. In America, the half-built battle cruisers Lexington and Saratoga were transformed into the largest, most advanced flat tops then in existence. Carrier-borne aviation was also making great strides during this period, but the necessary tactics to put these new weapons to use still lagged behind. In the late 1920s, U.S. Admiral Joseph Reeves, an early advocate of carrier air power, provided some of the answers. In a groundbreaking military exercise, he launched a successful mock attack on the Panama Canal from the carrier Saratoga. This proved that the aircraft carrier could do more than be the eyes and defense of the fleet. It could also be a potent offensive weapon. Despite this and other exercises demonstrating the aircraft carrier's offensive potential, the flat top was still seen mostly as a support ship to the main weapon in the fleets of the world, the mighty battleship. Proof was needed that aircraft carriers could knock out major military targets in actual combat. That proof was finally provided by the British Royal Navy more than a year before America and Japan locked horns in the Pacific. November 1940 was a desperate time for Britain. France had fallen, and the Italians, sensing a quick German victory, joined the war against England. The British Navy now had to contend with the powerful modern Italian fleet for control of the Mediterranean. The commanders of the outnumbered British Mediterranean fleet planned a daring attack, one that could even the odds with the Italians at a single stroke. The plan called for a squadron of 24 Swordfish torpedo planes launched from the decks of HMS Illustrious to strike the Italian fleet in its anchorage at Taranto on the heel of the Italian boot.
You will see from this model of Taranto Harbour that it is divided into two halves. In Mar Piccolo, the inner harbour, cruisers and destroyers are berthed here and here. Dividing them from Mar Grande is the dockyard town of Taranto. In the main harbour, there are 6 battleships, including the 2 latest 35,000-ton Littorio class. There are anti-torpedo nets here, barrage balloons moored to lighters here, more barrage balloons along here. There are flagships moored in the harbour, and round the perimeter are strong AA batteries. The Italians have no radar, but there is a network of sound locators linked up with the batteries. The air defense of Taranto, Il Duce thinks, is strong enough for him to put all his naval eggs in one basket. Just before 11 p.m., strike number 1 is located to the westward. Flares start to float down to the east. Torpedo bombers glide down to masthead level and approach the anchorage from the Italian warships silhouetted against the flares and the moonlight. These stately string bags press on through flak, scraping past balloon cables to score 2 torpedo hits on the Littorio and another on the Conti di Cavour. It's all over in a few minutes, but scarcely had the sound of these aircraft engines died away than more flares appear to the eastward. In comes strike number 2. This time, the torpedo bombers come in over Cape Rondinella. The AA barrage breaks out with renewed vigor. Everything but the kitchen stove is thrown into the air. But like their predecessors, in come more swordfish at 0 feet, wading and jinking through it all. Strike 2, score a 3rd torpedo hit on the Littorio, and another fatal one on the Caio Duilio. The bombers hit the seaplane sheds, the oil tanks, and more ships in Mar Piccolo. Number 1 strike leader was shot down into the harbour, but the pilot and observer were picked up and taken prisoner. 1 swordfish of the 2nd strike was never seen again. 1 battleship sunk, 2 others knocked out for the rest of the war. The Italian Navy's battleship strength halved, other ships and installation damaged, and all for the loss of 2 swordfish and 1 crew.
Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, the Japanese army was embroiled in a full-scale war with China. But the commander of the Japanese Navy, Isoroku Yamamoto, was making plans to fight a different opponent. The British attack on Taranto showed him a way to deal a crushing first blow to that opponent. At the time Yamamoto rose to command the Japanese fleet in the late 1930s, the militarists in control of the Japanese government were bent on expansion into China and the South Pacific to secure the supplies of raw materials required by Japan's growing industrial economy. The United States, with its own territorial and commercial interests in those areas, strongly opposed that expansion, putting the 2 nations on a collision course from which neither seemed willing or able to turn away. As a young naval attaché in Washington, Yamamoto had seen the vast industrial might of the United States firsthand. He knew that Japan would be overwhelmed in a lengthy naval war with America. He had vigorously argued against such a war. But once the decision was made to fight, Yamamoto's strong sense of duty compelled him to lead the way. He believed that Japan's only chance was to win a quick and decisive victory over the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Yamamoto saw in his aircraft carriers the potential for such a victory. Drawing on the gambling spirit he had honed playing poker in America, Yamamoto expanded on the tactics the British used at Taranto. He detached the 6 largest aircraft carriers from the rest of his fleet and formed them into an independent striking force. Then he sent them and a screening formation of 14 other warships across 4,000 miles of open sea to within striking distance of the Hawaiian Islands. Their target, the U.S. Pacific Fleet anchorage at Pearl Harbor. The morning of December 7, 1941, dawned calm and peaceful over the islands. A war alert had been sounded, but no one seriously expected the blow to fall here. It was a Sunday, and people went about their routine business more or less as they had on countless other Sundays before. But just 275 miles away, the Japanese were preparing to launch the largest carrier airstrike in history. At 6 a.m., 214 Japanese warplanes roared off the decks of their flat tops. Surprise was complete. All 8 of the battleships in the U.S. Pacific Fleet were either sunk or damaged. But by a quirk of fate, all 3 American aircraft carriers then stationed in the Pacific were spared. They were at sea on various missions during the attack. This was to have dire consequences for the Japanese in the coming months. Nevertheless, Pearl Harbor was a spectacular victory for the Japanese. Yamamoto's gamble had paid off, and he had clearly demonstrated that the aircraft carrier could be a powerful offensive weapon. With little organized resistance from the shattered U.S. fleet, Yamamoto and his carriers literally ran wild across the Pacific. Over the next several months, they won victory after victory. In response to the Japanese threat, America was gearing up to fight the battles that would ultimately win the war. But after months of nothing but defeats in the Pacific, morale was low. U.S. leaders needed to find a way to boost the spirits of the American public. A bold plan was devised. 16 medium land-based bombers would be launched from the decks of an aircraft carrier within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. Their target? Tokyo. On April 18, 1942, the heavily loaded B-25s under the command of Colonel Jimmy Doolittle lumbered down the perilously short decks of the carrier USS Hornet and struggled into the air. After bombing their targets, they made their way to crash landings in China. Doolittle and his men were hailed as heroes. Though the daring raid caused little actual damage, it did boost U.S. morale. Even more important, it was a stinging blow to Japanese pride, a blow that they could not allow to be repeated. Admiral Yamamoto and the rest of the Japanese high command were now more convinced than ever that the U.S. flat tops must be eliminated. Yamamoto conceived a plan to lure them into battle and destroy them at Midway Island. But before this operation could be put into action, another battle occurred that was to have a major effect on the way all future naval battles in the Pacific would be fought. April 12, 1942. U.S. naval intelligence intercepted and decoded Japanese messages revealing their plan to take the Australian outpost to Port Moresby on the island of New Guinea. If they succeeded, they would be able to choke off the flow of Allied supplies to Australia. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of U.S. naval forces in the Pacific, who had been appointed to replace Admiral Husband E. Kimmel after the Pearl Harbor fiasco, dispatched a task force centering on the carriers Lexington and Yorktown, along with 8 heavy cruisers and a dozen destroyers, to stop the Japanese invasion force, which was then heading into the Coral Sea. The Japanese fleet was led by 3 flat tops and 6 heavy cruisers. Though outnumbered in carriers and aircraft, U.S. forces had the advantage of knowing the Japanese objective. Despite this knowledge, the American fleet still failed to find the main Japanese striking force. Finally, on May 7th, after 3 days of searching, a Japanese carrier from an advance force was sighted. For the first time in their history, U.S. naval air forces prepared to attack an enemy aircraft carrier at sea. The 2,000 crewmen on board each flat top sprang into action. The aircraft were fueled and armed on the hangar deck below. Then they were lifted by elevator to the flight deck, where members of the flight deck crew helped move them into place. Engines were started and wings were unfolded into takeoff position. As the planes taxied to their start points, the carrier accelerated to full speed and turned into the wind to aid their takeoff. Finally, the launch officer gave the go signal, and the planes thundered down the teakwood flight deck. The debut of naval air power was an auspicious one. The Japanese light carrier Shoho was quickly overwhelmed and sunk by the 93 U.S. planes that swarmed over her. The message, "Scratch one flat top," was jubilantly flashed back to the U.S. task force. Despite this success, the 2 larger Japanese carriers had remained untouched. The next day, the Japanese struck back with a vengeance, throwing 69 aircraft at the Americans. Yorktown was damaged by bombs, and the Lexington was left dead in the water by 2 torpedoes. U.S. counterattacks on the Japanese carriers left them both damaged but unsunk. The Lexington was not so lucky. With no power to provide pressure in her water hoses, the fires on board raged unchecked. Finally, it was realized that nothing more could be done, and Captain Frederick Sherman gave the order to abandon ship. The Battle of the Coral Sea was over. Though U.S. losses were slightly heavier than those suffered by the Japanese, the invasion of Port Moresby was turned back and Australia's supply line was preserved. For the first time in history, aircraft carriers had faced each other in combat. This allowed the entire battle to be fought without a single opposing ship exchanging fire. In fact, the 2 fleets never even sighted each other. The day of the battleship was passing. Because of its ability to carry the fight to the enemy beyond the horizon, the carrier had demonstrated that it could be a more effective striking force for combat at sea. Midway Island, June 1942. 1 month after the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Japanese made their move on this tiny American-held bastion in the Pacific. Thanks to the code-breaking units of naval intelligence, Nimitz knew their objective. He was faced with a pivotal decision: hold his carriers out of battle and lose Midway, an important link in America's Pacific defense perimeter, or fight and risk losing the backbone of his fleet. Demonstrating the calmness under pressure and the courage to take necessary risks that made him one of America's greatest wartime commanders, Nimitz decided to fight. Yamamoto knew the American flat tops were the last remaining force capable of blocking Japanese domination of the Pacific. So hoping for a decisive victory, he committed virtually his entire fleet of over 70 ships to the battle. His main striking force consisted of 4 large carriers, all veterans of Pearl Harbor. Nimitz knew that he would need all the resources he could scrape together to have a chance of winning. He poured reinforcements, including a squadron of Army Air Corps B-17s into Midway. But the Japanese forces were still immensely superior. Meanwhile, the Yorktown, badly damaged in the Coral Sea battle, was in dry dock at Pearl Harbor. The experts said that it would take at least 3 months to repair her. Nimitz gave them 3 days. Working round the clock, the shipyard workers at Pearl did the job. "72 hours after she arrived, the Yorktown was on her way to Midway to join the Enterprise, Hornet, and their supporting screen of 8 cruisers. Nimitz skillfully positioned his fleet northeast of Midway, so it would be out of range of Japanese search planes. Midway-based planes could do the scouting, while the U.S. carriers remained safely out of sight. The Japanese, who confidently expected to lure the American carriers into an ambush, were themselves sailing into a trap. As their fleet approached Midway, everything seemed to be going according to plan. The U.S. fleet was nowhere in sight. Unsuspecting Midway would fall easy prey to a quick invasion. Then the U.S. carriers would be sunk when they steamed to the rescue. But unknown to the Japanese, American forces on Midway were on full alert. Early on the morning of June 4th, a Midway-based PBY flying boat sighted the Japanese carriers. All 120 U.S. aircraft on the island were thrown against them, while the American carriers turned southwest to close with the Japanese. In spite of heroic efforts, the land-based strike from Midway failed, and the island felt the full force of over 100 Japanese warplanes. The attack was savage, but so was the American defense. 38 Japanese planes were shot down. 30 others were so heavily damaged they would never fly again. Though battered, the facilities on Midway remained largely intact. The Japanese strike commander recommended another attack against Midway. The planes that had been held in reserve to deal with any American ships in the area were ordered rearmed to hit a ground target. The time this took opened a window of opportunity for the Americans. U.S. carriers had launched a force of 150 planes the moment they came within range of the Japanese. Now, that strike was nearing its target. The torpedo planes came in first, as Ensign George Gay remembers.
Most of us were brand new ensigns right out of training. When we got to Midway and were to make our takeoff, it was the first time we'd ever carried a torpedo, pickle as we called them. They had about 75 airplanes down there trying to eat us up, and we only had 15, so we didn't last very long. I was tail end Charlie, last aircraft in the whole formation, and I was kind of sitting back here watching this whole thing. I made my attack on this carrier, and I somehow got in close enough to drop my torpedo and get through. The Zeros jumped on me again out on the other side and shot me down. So when I came back to the surface, bumped into my life raft. Also, this black cushion. I didn't want them to pick me up. So I put this cushion over my head. I was able to stay there all day, even though they were picking people up all over the place. I'm sitting right in the front row here of this big battle. So I was just cheering like a football game.
While the Japanese fighters were at low altitude, decimating the American torpedo planes, a single formation of U.S. dive bombers came in high and took them by surprise. They caught the Japanese carriers with their decks crammed full of rearming and refueling aircraft. The next 5 minutes changed the entire course of the war.
I saw our dive bombers come in and knew all those boys too, and I knew that this was their first dive, not only with a bomb aboard, but in that airplane.
The remnants of the American planes headed home to their carriers, leaving 3 of the 4 Japanese flat tops flaming wrecks. It was a staggering blow, but the Japanese weren't defeated. The 4th Japanese carrier remained undamaged. Her pilots were told to sink the American carriers at all costs. At 2:30 p.m., 40 Japanese warplanes bore in on the Yorktown. Most of the Japanese planes were shot down, but 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes found their mark. The hasty repairs Yorktown had received before the battle now took their toll. Damage control parties were unable to control the flooding, and the ship was lost. 5 hours later, the Yorktown was avenged when 24 dive bombers from the Enterprise, including 10 refugee planes from the Yorktown, found the last Japanese carrier and sank her. Admiral Yamamoto had gotten the decisive naval battle he'd wanted, but the fortunes of war had turned the tide against him. The Battle of Midway tore the heart out of the Japanese striking forces. It was a blow from which they would never completely recover. The battles of Midway and the Coral Sea ushered in a new era in naval warfare, an era in which the aircraft carrier was clearly the dominant factor. June 1944. In England, Allied forces were making last-minute preparations for the great invasion of Normandy that was to liberate Europe from the Nazis. Meanwhile, in the 2 years since Midway, the art of carrier warfare had been perfected. In a series of island-hopping campaigns aimed at putting American forces within striking distance of Japan, the U.S. fleet, centered on its carriers, had been unstoppable. There was no longer any doubt. The flat top was now the main offensive weapon of the fleet. The once mighty battleship had been relegated to the roles of shore bombardment and anti-aircraft defense. Now U.S. Navy Task Force 58, with 15 aircraft carriers at its core that could launch nearly 1,000 combat aircraft, was moving towards its next objective, the island of Saipan in the Marianas. Part of the reason America had been able to forge such an awesome weapon as TF-58 was the dedication and drive of the men and women involved in U.S. war production, particularly in the field of shipbuilding. With the ranks of the male workforce thinned by service in the armed forces, over 6 million women stepped in to take their places. By 1944, they filled 10% of the positions in U.S. shipyards. Between January 1942 and June 1944, American shipyards launched no less than 18 fast carriers for the Pacific Theater. Only 6 were launched by the Japanese. In addition, the U.S. was able to outproduce the Japanese in carrier aircraft by a ratio of more than 3 to 1. All this despite the fact that the European theater received more than 80% of U.S. war production. Admiral Yamamoto's fears about America's huge industrial capacity were proving true. She was producing a tidal wave of armaments that threatened to sweep the Japanese from the seas. Nevertheless, the Japanese were determined to keep Saipan out of U.S. hands. They knew that if the Marianas fell, America would have air bases from which the Japanese home islands could be pounded by long-range bombers. With redoubled training and shipbuilding efforts, the Japanese had managed to build up formidable carrier forces once again, more than making up for the terrible losses they sustained at Midway. Now they reacted with full force, sending virtually their entire fleet with its 9 aircraft carriers against the Americans' 15 flat tops. While the Japanese fleet closed in, the flat tops of TF-58 were preparing to launch a series of devastating attacks on enemy airfields near Saipan. Between June 13th and 18th, hundreds of sorties were flown against air bases on Iwo Jima, Chichijima, Guam, and Rota. These attacks virtually eliminated Japanese land-based air power in the area. The Japanese carriers would have to face the U.S. fleet on their own. They counted on the longer range of their 430 aircraft to allow them to strike the first blow. On June 19, 1944, that blow fell with full force on Task Force 58. Under the direction of the gunner's mates who commanded each gun mount, the American crews stocked their anti-aircraft guns with ammunition. They poured a hail of fire at the attacking Japanese. Using their powerful new F-6F Hellcat fighters and the greater experience they possessed over the newly trained Japanese pilots, U.S. flyers helped turn the attack into a rout. Out of a Japanese force of 328 aircraft, 223 were destroyed. The two fleets drew apart overnight to lick their wounds and prepare for the rest of the battle. After an all-day search on June 20th, the Japanese fleet was finally sighted over 300 miles away. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of the U.S. carriers, knew that if he launched an attack at such an extreme range, his planes would not return until well after dark. But he also knew that an opportunity to inflict a decisive defeat on the Japanese could not be missed. At 4:20 p.m., 216 American planes from 10 aircraft carriers lofted into the air on what many of their pilots believed would be their final flight.
I know that a lot of us gave a salute as we were going across the deck, because we figured that that was the longest carrier strike. It just didn't seem too probable that some of us may get back. But we went into it with that realization.
At 6:44 p.m., the U.S. strike found its quarry. Within an hour, one Japanese flat top and 65 planes were destroyed. As the American planes winged their way home in the gathering darkness, Mitcher knew they were in danger of not being able to find their carriers. Deciding to take a huge tactical risk, he ordered the blazing of every available light aboard his ships to help guide his pilots home. Mitcher's heroic gamble made him a legend in U.S. naval aviation.
I just couldn't believe that anyone would turn on the lights. It was against, like you say, all doctrine. It was against all experience. It wasn't until they said land at nearest base and the signal getting stronger that I was able to visualize that it was, in reality, that very point, that the lights were turned off for us.
In the end, almost 500 Japanese aircraft were blasted from the skies around Saipan. Only 29 U.S. aircraft were lost. This made the so-called Marianas Turkey Shoot not only the largest carrier battle in history, but the most one-sided. It also ensured that the Japanese would not have enough time to reinforce their decimated carrier air unit before the U.S. fleet made its next move. October 1944, Leyte Island. It was here that the U.S. High Command chose to begin the liberation of the Philippines. On the afternoon of October 20th, General Douglas MacArthur fulfilled his promise to return to the islands the Japanese had forced him to leave 2.5 years before. The Japanese High Command knew that if the Philippines were lost, its Navy would be cut off from its supply of fuel in Southeast Asia. They decided to use their once proud carrier forces as decoys to lure the American flat tops away from the landing beaches. This would allow their surface forces to hit the exposed U.S. transports from the south. Admiral William Bull Halsey took the bait. Demonstrating more aggressiveness than judgment, the commander of the U.S. carriers charged after the Japanese flat tops, hoping to finish them off once and for all. Without the pilots and aircraft they had lost in the Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Japanese carriers were little more than empty husks. But Halsey was unaware of this. He still considered the Japanese flat tops to be the main threat to the American fleet. He threw everything he had at them, a total of 527 sorties in all. U.S. forces won a smashing victory, sinking 4 Japanese carriers, more than in any single engagement since Midway. Meanwhile, a powerful force of 5 Japanese battleships and 12 cruisers threaded their way toward the landing beaches of Leyte. All that stood between the Japanese attack fleet and the U.S. transports was a force of 16 American escort carriers, or CVEs. Never intended for a major fleet engagement, these tiny escort ships carried about 20 planes each, as compared to the 80 to 100 embarked by the larger fleet carriers. Nevertheless, they found themselves face to face with the biggest guns in the Japanese Navy. Retired Vice Admiral J.P. Whitney was skipper of an escort carrier at the battle. He remembers sighting the Japanese battle wagons coming toward him.
They looked like pagodas, walking on the water. Here they were, coming over the horizon, right straight for us. Well, there wasn't anything to do but to turn around and start running. While this was going on, of course, we were arming the rest of our planes, but in order to launch, we had to turn right back into the Japanese fleet again, because that's where the wind was from. Of course, all this time we were under fire, you understand. On the CVEs, we had 1 5-inch gun on the stern. Well, in order to maintain morale, we were throwing smoke at that time and everything else.
The so-called baby flat tops launched their air groups to strike the Japanese fleet from the sky. The attacks were desperate and relentless. Some U.S. planes made up to 20 passes at the enemy ships, many of them even after all their ammunition was gone, just to divert the Japanese gunners from the escort carriers for a few precious moments. The attacks worked.
In the late morning, after we'd been under fire for over 2 hours, the Japanese admiral turned around and headed back. I read somewhere that he thought that he was running into the heavy carrier groups. And here we were, just little CVEs.
This proved that even the most powerful battleships were no match for aircraft flown from carriers. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was finished, and so was the Japanese fleet as an effective fighting force. But the Japanese still had an ace up their sleeve, one they would play with deadly effect 6 months later off the shores of Okinawa, as the U.S. fleet closed in on the Japanese home islands. For 5 days, the 18 battleships, 200 destroyers, and over 40 large and small carriers of the U.S. fleet hammered Japanese positions on Okinawa. Their goal, to take the island so it could be used as a staging base for an all-out assault on the Japanese mainland. When the landings were launched by American Marines on Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1945, they were practically unopposed. The initial wave of 50,000 U.S. troops moved inland after meeting only token resistance. It was as if the Japanese were hiding, biding their time for the best opportunity to strike. Aboard the ships offshore, American crews waited in tense anticipation for the Japanese onslaught they knew had to be coming. Finally, after almost a week, it came. The divine wind of the kamikaze broke like a terrible storm over the American ships off the shores of Okinawa. Desperately seeking a way to neutralize America's huge advantage in sea power, the Japanese sent wave after wave of suicide planes against the U.S. fleet. Their main mission was simple and direct: to sink as many American flat tops as they could. The kamikaze was a phenomenon unique in the annals of military history, named after a huge typhoon which destroyed an invading Mongol fleet in the 13th century. The ranks of the kamikazes were made up mainly of young volunteers. Once recruited, these volunteers were trained in the bare rudiments of flying and evasive maneuvers. The planes they flew were scraped together from the remnants of the Japanese air forces. Virtually anything that could fly was used. Far from being the supreme fanatics that many have portrayed them to be, most of the kamikazes were recent graduates or university students who were not particularly religious and who had no expectation of a blissful or heroic afterlife. Instead, they were motivated by the traditional Japanese sense of on, or obligation and gratitude toward their family and country, and by the customary Japanese tradition for a noble death in a worthy cause. When the kamikazes took off on their one-way flight to certain death, they did so in the belief that their individual sacrifice would help defeat the American fleet and save their homeland from invasion. Aboard their carriers, American fighter directors vectored U.S. fighters in to intercept the attacks. A high percentage were shot down before they reached their targets, but many slipped through. American light anti-aircraft guns, like these dual 40mm mounts, were good at shooting down Japanese planes but could not deal effectively with the kamikazes. To stop a suicide attack, it wasn't enough to shoot down the plane. It had to be completely destroyed. Day and night, the attacks raged on. On the island of Okinawa, the fighting had become just as fierce as it was offshore. U.S. carrier-based attack planes played a critical role in clearing the way for the 180,000 American soldiers then on shore by helping to blast the 100,000 Japanese defenders out of their entrenched positions. During the next 3 months, over 3,000 suicide attacks took a fearful toll on American naval forces. 368 ships were damaged, 34 were sunk, and nearly 5,000 sailors were killed, making Okinawa the bloodiest and longest-lasting battle in the history of the U.S. Navy. But these terrible losses did not drive the U.S. fleet away from the shores of Okinawa. Instead, American forces swept the sky clear of the Japanese and Okinawa was taken. For the first time ever, carrier-borne aviation had stood its own against sizable land-based forces in a sustained campaign. This endurance earned the ships off Okinawa the name, the fleet that came to stay. As the fighting drew closer to the Japanese home islands, the Battle of Okinawa left an awful warning of the immense human toll that would be paid if U.S. forces attacked Japan head-on. While the American carriers mounted attacks along the Japanese coast, raking airfields and bombing the remnants of the Japanese fleet, a decision was made that any and all means should be used to avoid an actual invasion of Japan. On August 5th, 1945, the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. After receiving no word from Japan, another bomb was dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later. Within a week, Japan had surrendered. The U.S. Navy now stood unchallenged in the vast expanses of the Pacific. Her fleet was not only the largest in the world, but the largest that had ever existed. And the aircraft carrier was the backbone of that fleet. In 4 years, this formidable vessel had risen from a secondary role to become the most powerful ship on the seas. American naval commanders had been able to quickly adapt their tactics to take advantage of the carrier's unique beyond-the-horizon attack capability after the U.S. battleships were sunk at Pearl Harbor. Then, America efficiently harnessed her huge industrial capacity to produce flat tops in overwhelming numbers. These factors were crucial in allowing the United States to rebound from her early defeats and win a complete victory over Japan. America had won the largest naval war in history, and the aircraft carrier had played a pivotal role.